The last moments of Aria Thorpe, the case that shocked Britain. On a quiet December evening in England, a 9-year-old girl was inside what should have been the safest place in the world, her own home. But within minutes, that home became the center of a tragedy that would leave an entire community searching for answers. Her name was Aria Thorpe. She was only 9 years old, and the investigation that followed would lead police to a teenager, a trail of CCTV footage, and a courtroom battle over what really happened that night. This is the story of the case that shocked Britain. On the evening of December 15th, 2025, emergency services were called to a home in Weston-super-Mare, Somerset, after concerns were raised about a child. Inside, officers discovered 9-year-old Aria Thorpe suffering from serious injuries. Despite efforts to save her, Aria was pronounced dead. The news spread quickly. A child had lost her life inside her own home. For many people living nearby, the question was immediate. How could something like this happen? The investigation began immediately. Police secured the area. Detectives started gathering evidence. And every minute of Aria's final moments became important. As investigators worked through the evidence, attention turned toward a 16-year-old boy. Because he was under 18, his identity was protected by law. He could not be publicly named. But prosecutors later alleged that he was responsible for Aria's death. The teenager was arrested and charged with murder. However, the accused denied the allegation. The case would become a battle between two very different versions of events. One of the most important pieces of evidence presented to the court was CCTV footage. Prosecutors told the jury that the teenager was captured on surveillance cameras near Worrell railway station only minutes after the attack. Those recordings became a key part of the timeline. A few minutes, a few movements, a journey away from the scene. Investigators wanted to know exactly what happened during that short window of time. Because in a murder investigation, sometimes the smallest details can become the biggest clues. The court also heard allegations about what happened after the incident. Prosecutors claimed the teenager made statements to other people after leaving the area. These claims became another important part of the case. But the defense argued a different explanation. They said the death was not intentional and challenged the prosecution's interpretation of events. The jury was asked to examine every piece of evidence carefully. Every statement, every camera recording, every moment. Behind the courtroom details was the story of a young girl whose life ended far too soon. Aria was only 9 years old, a child who should have been thinking about school, friends, and ordinary childhood moments. Instead, her name became linked to one of the most disturbing criminal cases in the country. The community struggled to understand what had happened. Flowers and tributes appeared. People came together to remember a young girl who never had the chance to grow up. Cases involving children are among the most difficult investigations for police and courts. They require careful handling. Every fact must be tested. Every accusation must be proven. And every person involved must be treated according to the law. That is why the trial of the 16-year-old accused teenager became so closely watched. The question before the jury was not simply what happened. It was whether the evidence proved beyond reasonable doubt who was responsible. As the trial continued, one thing remained clear. A family had lost a child. A community had been shaken. And a courtroom was left to piece together the final moments of a 9-year-old girl named Aria Thorpe. The truth would depend on the evidence, the timeline, and the decisions made after that tragic night. Because behind every investigation is more than a case file. There is a person, a family, and a life that can never be replaced. The courtroom now became the place where every unanswered question would be examined. The jury listened as prosecutors carefully reconstructed the timeline surrounding Aria's final moments. They described the movements of the accused teenager, the CCTV evidence, and the events that allegedly followed the discovery of the child's injuries. But in a case like this, a timeline is only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The central question remained, was this a deliberate act or was there another explanation? The defense challenged the prosecution's version of events. They argued that the situation was not as simple as it first appeared. They questioned the meaning of certain statements, the interpretation of evidence, and the conclusions drawn from the investigation. In criminal trials, suspicion alone is not enough. The responsibility of the prosecution is to prove the accusation beyond reasonable doubt, and the jury's task is to separate emotion from evidence. For detectives, the investigation into Aria's death would have been one of the most difficult cases they had ever handled. Every piece of information mattered. The CCTV recordings, the witness accounts, the digital evidence, the movements of people connected to the case. A single moment caught on camera could change the direction of an entire investigation. A single statement could become a major turning point. The tragedy also raised difficult questions about violence involving young people. How can someone so young become involved in a case this serious? What events lead up to a moment that changes multiple lives forever? And could anyone have seen warning signs before it happened? These questions do not always have simple answers, but they are questions investigators, families, and communities are left carrying long after the courtroom doors close. For Aria's family, no verdict could undo what happened. A 9-year-old girl was gone. The future moments she should have experienced would never come. No birthdays, no school memories, no chance to grow older. The loss was permanent. Outside the courtroom, the public followed the case closely. Many people wanted answers. Many wanted justice. But the legal system had one responsibility: to examine the facts and reach a decision based on evidence. Not anger. Not rumors. Not assumptions. Only proof. As the trial continued, the story of Aria Thorpe remained a reminder of how quickly an ordinary day can become a devastating tragedy. A quiet home. A normal evening. A young life suddenly taken away. And a question that would remain at the center of the case: what truly happened in those final moments? The jury would eventually decide whether the evidence presented in court was enough to prove the charge. Until then, the case remained unfinished. A mystery built from minutes, a tragedy measured in a lifetime, and a little girl whose name became forever connected to a case that shocked Britain. As the trial moved forward, every detail from that night was examined under intense pressure. The prosecution continued to build its case around the sequence of events. They focused on what happened before the attack, what happened immediately afterward, and the movements captured on surveillance footage. For investigators, time was critical. In cases where a life has been lost, the smallest gap can become the biggest question. What happened in those missing minutes? Why did certain actions take place? And what was the true intention behind them? The court also considered the behavior of the accused after the incident. Prosecutors argued that his actions following Aria's death were significant. They said the journey away from the area and the statements allegedly made afterward formed part of the wider picture. But the defense continued to challenge those interpretations. They reminded the jury that evidence must be looked at carefully and fairly. A person can only be convicted if the case against them reaches the required legal standard. For the people of Weston-super-Mare, the case was not just about a courtroom. It was about a neighborhood that had been changed forever. A place where families lived ordinary lives suddenly became connected to a tragedy that no one expected. People who knew Aria remembered a young child whose life ended far too soon. The tributes left behind showed the impact she had on those around her. True crime cases often leave people searching for a reason. They ask, how did this happen? Could it have been prevented? What was happening inside the mind of the person accused? But sometimes the hardest truth is that investigations reveal facts, not always the complete answers people hope for. The justice system can decide responsibility, but it cannot bring back the person who was lost. As the courtroom listened to evidence, one fact remained at the center of everything. A 9-year-old girl named Aria Thorpe should have had many more years ahead of her. She should have been growing up, learning, making memories. Instead, her name became part of a criminal investigation that captured national attention. The final decision would rest with the jury. They would have to consider every piece of evidence presented. The CCTV, the witness testimony, the explanations from both sides, and the events surrounding one tragic night in December. Because in a murder trial, the truth is not decided by the loudest voices. It is decided by the evidence. And as Britain waited for the outcome, one question remained above all others. What really happened inside that home? The answer would determine the future of the accused teenager. But for Aria's family, the pain of losing their daughter would remain forever. A life ended, a community shaken, a case that would never be forgotten. The story of Aria Thorpe is not only a story about a crime investigation. It is also a story about the fragile line between an ordinary day and an unimaginable tragedy. On that December evening, no one expected that a quiet home in Weston-super-Mare would become the center of a case watched across Britain. But after the emergency call, everything changed. A family was left searching for answers. A community was left in shock. And investigators began the difficult task of rebuilding the final moments of a child's life. Every investigation begins with questions. Who was there? What happened? When did it happen? And why? Detectives follow evidence step by step. They look at movements. They examine digital records. They speak to witnesses. They compare every detail against the timeline. Because in a case like this, the truth is often hidden inside the smallest pieces. The teenager accused in Aria's death remained at the center of the trial. His age meant his identity could not be revealed publicly. The court had to balance two realities: the seriousness of the accusation and the legal protections given to a young defendant. That balance is one of the most challenging parts of the justice system. For those following the case, The most difficult question was the simplest one. How could a child's life end this way? There are no easy explanations, no words that can erase the loss, no courtroom decision that can return the years Aria should have had. The evidence presented during the trial would be studied carefully. The jury would have to decide whether the prosecution had proven its case, not based on emotion, not based on public opinion, but based on what could be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Whatever the final verdict, one thing would remain unchanged. A 9-year-old girl named Aria Thorpe became the center of a tragedy that affected countless people. Her name would forever be connected to a night of fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. A reminder that behind every headline is a human life, a family, a child, a future that disappeared too soon. The case of Aria Thorpe remains a story about evidence, justice, and the search for truth. A story where every second mattered, every decision mattered, and where the final answer would come not from rumors, but from the facts.